Okay, y'all can see my screen, right? Okay, thank you. So again, as we were kind of just saying, for those of you who've just entered, Nam was asking me why I cut off the reading in the middle of the sixth night. And the reason is that there are fewer stories than there are nights. There's some 200 or so stories, depending on how you cut it. There's different counts about how many stories Shahrazad tells. As you can imagine, it's kind of hard to figure out what counts as a story. And so people have different ideas about that. But one obvious point is that the stories do not map onto the nights. We don't have one story per night. We usually have multiple stories per night. Sometimes we have a story, however, actually quite often, almost always we have a story which goes on into the next night, which leaves us with a cliffhanger. And this is the way that Shahrazad is trying to keep the king engaged and keep herself alive so that he will keep her alive so she can finish the story tomorrow, right? So as Nam pointed out, he felt like he was the king and that the story had to go on. He wanted to know more, so he kept reading, and that's beautiful. I love that. That's great. That's the real joy of the 1001 Nights, right? I mean, it's such a finely crafted piece of writing that just keeps you reading and reading and reading and wanting to kind of go deeper into this labyrinth or this maze of narrative that it's playing with. Today, what we read were really two major stories. So you can think of these as like puzzles, right? Or as like nesting dolls, right? Where you open up one doll and you find the next doll inside and the next doll inside and so forth. Today we read two main stories really in the first 6 nights. The first main frame story is the merchant and the Ifrit, the merchant and the genie, these like big kind of demonic spirits, right? And sometimes they can be good, but usually they're frightening and terrifying and violent, right? And powerful, of course. So the first story was about the merchant and the Ifrit. We'll talk about that a little more. And then we have these inset tales where these 3 old men come and each of the old men has an animal with him and each of the old men talks about how this animal used to be a human being and the story about how that human being was changed into an animal. And each of the 3 men's stories is of course designed to try to save the merchant from the Ifrit who is going to kill him, right? Then we move into a new story, a story about the fisherman and the genie. And this is the story in which a fisherman saves a genie from a bottle where he was imprisoned for almost 2 millennia. And the genie says, "Thank you so much. I'm going to kill you now." And the fisherman says, "Whoa, you're going to kill me now? I just saved you. I just got you out of this prison. That's ingratitude, to say the least." And he says, "Let me tell you a story about ingratitude." And we move into a story about King Yunan and Duban, the sage. And then within that story, we of course get other stories. King Duban tells a story about Sinbad, and King Duban's vizier, his servant, tells a story about a prince and a gula. A gula is like a ghoul, right? It's another mythical creature that feeds on corpses. So another great, rich, and horrific mythical creature coming out of this text. So I want to kind of spend half our time with the merchant and the Ifrit and the 3 old men, and I want to spend the other half of our time with the story of Duban. Now, the merchant kills the Ifrit's son with the pit of a date, right? This is how the story starts. He's eating some fruit, he's eating a date, and there's a pit, and he tosses the date. He tosses the pit of the date, and the Ifrit's son, these Ifrit are magical creatures, right? Sometimes they can be super small, so small you can't even see them. Sometimes they can be super big, right? Like a skyscraper. And this pit of the date lands on and crushes and kills the tiny son of the Ifrit. So the Ifrit demands blood, right? The Ifrit says, "You killed my son. Justice must be done. I am going to kill you." I want to always think about what the lessons are here. Remember, Shahrazad is trying to teach King Shahryar through her narratives. What do you think this conveys? Will you ever eat fruit in the same way? Will you ever throw the pit of a piece of fruit away nonchalantly? What does this suggest? What do you think? One takeaway might be that we live in a world of chance, right? We live in a world defined by accidents. And these accidents are random, aren't they? You're eating a piece of fruit and there's a pit and you just toss it to the side and it kills somebody. What a random world. What a world of random accidents. What a world of coincidence, of chaos, in fact. What a chaotic world. Why begin with this story? Why lead with this story? Well, it is introducing one of Shahrazad's major projects, one of Shahrazad's major questions. Her question is, can intelligent beings, like you, King Shahryar, organize a system of justice in such a world? If the world is given to chance, chaos, coincidence, can human beings combat that and organize a system of justice? So that's going to be one of the major questions, right? Now, I'm going to put this question in the chat box. I'll just stop sharing and throw it in there right now. And I want you to talk with each other about this. And I want you to focus on, there it is, it's in the chat box. I want you to focus on the three old men stories. So this is the setup. This is the frame within the frame, right? We're in stories within stories within stories. So the way this one works is the Ifrit is going to kill the merchant because the merchant accidentally killed his son. And the Ifrit is going to kill him in return. And these three old men arrive and they each tell a story. And they ask the Ifrit, they say, if my story is good, if you like my story, can it buy 1/3 of the freedom or 1/3 of the penalty of the merchant, right? And each one tells a story, and one by one, the Ifrit says, okay, good story. You get 1/3 of the penalty for the merchant. Until finally, all three have told a story, and the merchant is excused, he is redeemed, he is absolved, he is set free with no penalty, right? So the question is, what are the three old men stories? They all have an animal with them, and they talk about how that animal is actually a human who has transformed into that animal. What are the stories? They're on pages 15 to 24 of our text. And what is the lesson of the story? You could focus on just one, or you could focus on more. They're all interrelated. They all have interrelated themes. But what are the lessons? What is Shahrazad trying to teach the king with these stories? Okay, so let's go in a breakout room and discuss that for 10 minutes. And then we'll come back and talk about it together. And then we will move to the second story, the second major frame story for today, which is the story of the fisherman and the genie. And then we'll spend the last 20 to 25, 30 minutes or so talking about some writing stuff. All right? Okay, so remember, talk to each other. When you go into a breakout room, don't just disappear. You have a responsibility here to talk to your classmates and a responsibility to yourself to engage. All right? So give it a go. Even if you're just going to say, I'm confused by this story, that's useful, that's helpful. That's a good way to start thinking with your classmates. Okay, here come some breakout rooms. We'll take 10 minutes and then come back.
Hello. Tuấn.
Hello. Nam look one.
Hello.
I don't know. You guys want to speak in English or Vietnamese? Okay, sure.
Okay. Hmm. Nói tiếng Việt nhé, dễ
Okay, yo.
um, mình thấy có một cái điểm chung, nghĩa là chắc là cả ba cái nó đều nói về kiểu luật nhân quả, là làm điều xấu sẽ được nhận được xấu, nhưng mà ờm, trong đấy thì cái việc xấu này nó không cực đoan đến mức như kiểu phản chinh xong giết, mà là chỉ là biến một con vật xong rồi một lúc sau, nghĩa là trong một khoảng thời gian sẽ được biến lại thành người. Chỉ có thể là giống như tuần trước thầy bảo là ờm, đoạn đầu là kể chuyện sẽ hơi đồng ý với cả ông vua một tí, sau rồi càng ngày nó sẽ càng lái ngược ông ấy lại bảo là thế này không được. Mình nghĩ vậy. Yes.
Vậy Nam có nghĩ tại sao nó lại khác như vậy không? Tại vì thực ra không biết, em nghĩ kiểu tại vì lẽ ra là phải cùng cùng mang nội dung chứ nhỉ, tại vì lẽ là dịch thuật ra thì cũng ấy, tại vì câu chuyện này nó cũng không hẳn là dành cho trẻ em lắm, nó cũng đã có những cái yếu tố mà nó không nên là dành cho trẻ em rồi. Thì dù có đổi chi tiết một xíu thì nó cũng, ai ở đâu nó cũng không thể không bao quát được hết thì cũng không sửa đổi được gì.
Ông
Mình cũng thấy vậy.
chuyện giống kiểu giống hai ông kia quá nên là tóm tắt thôi, nhưng mà khác một chút.
Nó, kiểu, không có nhiều chi tiết bằng ấy, với cả, nó xuyên suốt nó chỉ có một cái, gọi là gì nhỉ? Cái, nội dung chính là về, ông vợ à đâu, bà vợ chứ. Ờ, với cả là nó không có nó không có nhiều câu chuyện nhỏ ở bên trong ấy, như là hai cái ông đằng trước kể, mình nghĩ thế.
Rất ngắn, nhưng mà có thể là bởi vì kiểu ba câu chuyện nó cũng khá là giống nhau nên là uh, Shahrazad muốn kiểu get to the point, bảo là đây nhân từ thôi, đừng quá đà.
nghĩ kiểu tại sao mà kiểu lại nghĩ ba câu chuyện này nó lại giống nhau cỡ vậy không?
Chuyện mà chứ chém thế nào chả được.
Y kiểu giống như là cái này nó đúng như kiểu như là kiểu kéo dài cái sự của mình á, ý là kiểu như để cho nói sao nhỉ, để cho ông vua câu chuyện nó như kiểu là Buzzole ấy hả? Kiểu là ấy không ta, tại vì thiệt nó giống nhau khá khá, cũng khó để mà so sánh.
Chắc là kiểu việc quan trọng ba lần chỉ được ba lần.
Quên mất cùng câu hỏi của thầy cả, mình có luôn không, nhưng mọi người cảm thấy là bây giờ đọc chuyện là the lesson, the story and how does Sarah approach it.
Nghĩa là chắc là kiểu ừm, ba câu chuyện của cái ông già này cũng relate được đến vụ vợ của ông vua ấy, thì um, nói như nào nhỉ?
Ừ, cũng thấy vậy, cái cách approach teaching này nó giống như kiểu là thông qua một câu chuyện ngụ ngôn như kiểu Việt Nam mình hay nói á, để kiểu ẩn dụ ẩn ý cho những cái điều mà bà này muốn hướng tới cho ông vua á.
Ý.
Nhưng mà hình như là tất cả cả nếu vậy thì bao nhiêu đêm cũng cũng là như vậy ha, thì có cái nào mà nó chi tiết hơn không nhỉ, có gì đặc biệt hơn so với các đêm khác?
Có câu cái chuyện một với chuyện ba đều là kiểu phụ nữ related, còn câu
Đúng, chuyện hai, đúng, chuyện hai tôi để
hmm,
ý là thấy nó cứ bị không special một chỗ chỗ nào ấy, tại vì thầy cũng đang, nghĩa là thầy hỏi phần này chắc cũng phải có gì đó đặc biệt đúng không, mà thấy nó cứ
hay là kiểu tại vì sẽ có hai câu chuyện là woman bad và một câu chuyện là woman good, kind of good, thì nghĩa là hai câu chuyện sẽ đồng cảm với sự bị phản bội bởi vợ của vua, xong một chuyện bảo là thực ra phụ nữ tốt đấy, tin phụ nữ đi. Yes, good point, very nice discussion.
Yes, thank you guys.
Okay. Are you back? You look like you're back. Okay. What do you think? Let's think about this first story with the merchant and the Ifrit and the three old men who tell their own stories. What are some of the lessons here? What are some of the stories? Let me hear from you. What did you discuss? Did anyone discuss the first story? Shall I remind you of it? It's a tale of an old man who has a gazelle, right? And the gazelle, he says, is his wife. His wife was a sorceress, and his wife, the sorceress, was angry because he had a son with a slave woman. So he went away from home, and his wife turned the woman into a cow, and she turned his son into a calf. And the man unknowingly slaughtered the cow, slaughtered his slave woman slash mistress, and he was about to slaughter the calf, his son, and then Shahrazad breaks off the story, of course, right? The cliffhanger. And she goes on and finishes it the next day to talk about how he gave the fat calf, who was his son, to his servants, and his servant's daughter was a sorceress as well, and she recognized, hey, this is a man. And she brought him back into human shape, and then she turned his evil wife into a gazelle. What do you make of this story? What's this story doing? How does it bear upon what Shahrazad is up to with the king? Yeah, what do you think, Nam? Really good point, Nam. Really good point. So in the first story, what we see is that we have one evil woman, the sorceress wife. She's the evil woman, right? And she turns the other woman, the slave woman, into a cow and the son into a calf and tries to get her husband to kill them. So she's pretty purely evil, we might say. At the same time, it's a woman who saves them too, right? So we have one woman who is bad, and then we have another woman who is the daughter of the vizier who saves the son. So the son is endangered by one woman, he is saved and rescued by another woman. So what this story is trying to do, you might argue, as I think Nam and his group are arguing, is break down King Shahryar's way of seeing things in black and white, right? His way of seeing things actually in terms of good and evil, simply right or wrong. Instead, she's trying to urge him to see the world in a more nuanced way, right? And I really like that you bring it back to the frame story and the story of the bride, the stolen bride there, because indeed, in this stolen bride, we see a very vengeful woman who's doing something which, within the context of the 1001 Nights, would be very unvirtuous, very bad behavior, sleeping around so much. At the same time, we see that she's a victim, that she's been stolen when she was intending to marry properly, right? So also, in the second story, as Nam brought up, we have an Ifrita, a female jinn, right? A female genie. And we have the man's two brothers who try to rob him and kill his wife, the Ifrita, whom they think is a human, right? And then she goes back and she's going to kill the men. And what does she decide to do instead? She turns them into dogs, right? She turns them into dogs at the man's urging. The man says, don't kill them, please. I know they're the worst guys around, but they're my brothers. So here we have a story of mercy, right? A story of mercy. So one lesson here is to forgive, to be merciful. Another good lesson for King Shahryar, right? And also, as Nam points out, you have in this another example of a female, this female Ifrita, who is quite good, in fact, right? She's ultimately good. What else? Other reactions to these stories? Nguyen Tao, please go ahead.
Orion found out that comparing to the first story, the third story touched directly to the king's wound and is far more shorter than the first story. The third story was rather short comparing to the first one, and all of them, all including turning people into animal, and we see that as a sign of degrading the individuals. So
yeah, that's great. I'm happy you brought that up. Really good point. What does it mean to be turned into an animal? It means to be made into something less than human, right? And we can go further with that. This is how you would develop a thesis statement. You'd say, okay, I've got something interesting here. I've got my finger on something interesting. To be turned into an animal is somehow to be made less than human. Okay, let me get close to the text now. Who is turned into an animal? Well, good people are turned into animals, and so are bad people, right? What do I make of that? What might we say about the fact that both good and bad people are essentially dehumanized, are thrown into a position of being subhuman, less than human? Is there justice in the world? Now I'm getting somewhere deeper, right? Now I'm getting into a deeper claim about the significance of how people are being turned into animals, right? People are being made subhuman. This is how you develop significance into your thesis argument. You find something interesting going on in the text, and then you get closer to the text. You don't just stop and say people are turned into animals. You go closer and you say, who's being turned into animals? And you say, wait a minute, an innocent boy is turned into an animal, and so is a murderous woman. What does that mean? Perhaps it's making some reference to injustice, right? I see other hands up. Sung, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think that there's also a lesson of justice, like people who do evil will be punished, whether it be intentional or unintentional. So the demon was in a way punishing the merchant for murdering his son, and I think there's also a theme that runs through other stories later on. That is like the acceptance of fate. Like your fate is kind of like predetermined by the god, and and in other in other stories as well, the person who is gonna get killed always says that like let them have some time to sort out their affairs. So I think that maybe says something about caring for others. Like the merchant wanted some time to return to his wife and children to let them know and all of that. So I think that's a common theme throughout all of the stories. Yeah.
Yeah, really good attention to these themes. And if you were to build a paper out of this, what you would want to do, I'm going to be talking more and more about paper writing, so I'm going to try to keep kind of bringing this back to thinking about writing. What you would want to do is say, okay, I found two interesting themes, and I want to think about how one theme informs the other. I see maybe 3 examples where people are going to be killed, and whoever is going to kill them says, there will be a stay of execution. You can go home, see your family, get your affairs in order, and then come back tomorrow for your execution, right? So this is indeed a recurring theme, as Zong points out. And you'd want to read them and say, how does one help us understand the other? Where do they differ? Where are they the same? And now you're getting into a kind of cohesive argument where you're using one part of the text to understand another part of the text. And that's ultimately what you want to be doing when you're doing textual analysis of this nature. Also, to talk about Zong's point about fate, I think you're right. There's lots of really interesting points in these stories where people say, simply accept fate. But what they're really saying is accept God's plan, right? This comes back to providence. You remember we talked about providence when we were talking about Genesis and the Hebrew Bible. The God of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible is the same God of the Gospel of Mark in Christianity, is the same God of the 1001 Nights in Islam. All of these gods are the God of Abraham. So this story, when the story references God's plan or references something like fate, we might say, it's not quite fate. Certainly not in the ancient Greek sense of the word. It's not quite destiny in that sense. It's more like the plan that a benevolent, intelligent, ultimate being, God, has for the individual, which one might not understand, right? And this is why bad things happen to good people, because we can't understand God's plan, and so you need to have some faith in it. And that would be the kind of underlying premise of the way that people talk about God's plan and providence in the 1001 Nights. I see a hand up from Lam Nguyen. Please go ahead, Nguyen.
Yeah. Yes, I think the interesting about the 3 story, all the women in the story have magic, so like they can freely express themselves, their feeling and what they want to do, so to compromise with political power of a man. So I think like it's unrealistic in the story of the mainframe story, because in the mainframe story the women doesn't have the power and they are dominant by men. So I think that's an interesting point that I want to bring in. And also I have the question that like I noticed the man let the other tell the spirit that their story are better than the previous one. And I noticed the pattern the later story it has having more mercy, people having more mercy and like caring about more the other more. So I wonder whether what it is that makes the later story better than the previous one, or what else.
Yeah, is that right? I don't remember that part. Is the third is it the Ifrit who says the third story is the best?
Yeah, the second is better than the first. The third is better than the second.
Ah, so each one is better than the one before. That's great. I love that. Well, you could do a lot with that, and that's a good open-ended question, right? That's a good start for a thesis. That's a good way that you would begin writing a paper. You'd say, okay, again, there's this interesting kind of motif. There's lots of repeating motifs in these stories. So what do I make of it? How do I understand it? Well, one thing that occurs to me, just kind of riffing off the top of my head, is that if you are Shahrazad, don't you want each story to be better than the next? Aren't you trying to tell the king, the stories are going to get better and better and better, don't worry. You know, if you liked this one, just wait till tomorrow. Oh, I can live till tomorrow, right? Because I got a great fucking story tomorrow. Can I live? Okay, great. And then the one that I tell in 2 days is going to be even better than the one I tell tomorrow, right? So in a way, it's a wonderful manipulation of the audience, right? And you see this again and again, actually, throughout the stories. You see on page 14, the first merchant, or I'm sorry, the first old man comes to the merchant. So the merchant has been told by the Ifrit, I'm going to kill you for killing my son with the pit of the date. And the merchant goes, he gets his affairs in order, he says goodbye to his family, he returns to the Ifrit for his execution. And while he's waiting for the Ifrit, the first merchant comes. Or I'm sorry, I keep mixing it up. The first old man comes. And the merchant tells him his story with the Ifrit. And on page 14, the merchant says, your story is wonderful. It would be a lesson for those who take heed. There are all of these references to stories like this. And they're regularly saying, stories are really fun. You should listen to them. And stories are really instructive. You should learn from them. It's like, nudge, nudge, Shahryar, are you paying attention? These stories aren't just entertainment. They also have lessons for you. So I guess that all of that comes to mind in the storytelling. But really good point. And I liked your point, Lan Nguyen, about how women have power. That's a very interesting element of these first 3 inset tales from the old men. We have powerful women, and again, some misuse that power, and some use that power in the right way. Okay,
can I follow with for
Go
your
ahead.
short questions? So like, why must be that type of fruit, like the tiny fruit kill the son of the curate? Why must be that type of it?
Why can you ask again, Nguyen? I didn't quite catch it.
The merchant killed the son of the curate with the tie of food, and I wonder why must be that type.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know. That would be a good research question where you'd want to try to figure out, look for the literary history of the date in Arabic writing, in pre-modern Arabic writing. I'm sure a date is a common fruit, and you might think about how this relates to pre-modern Arabic writing. Does the date carry some symbolic value in genres of writing? You know, any fruit in any tradition coming after the Hebrew Bible, as this Islamic tradition certainly is, will always harken back to the Garden of Eden as well, and can it is symbolically connectable to the notion of Adam and Eve eating forbidden fruit and committing the first sin, the first disobedience against God. And so there's perhaps something there generally. Really, you can kind of, anytime you see fruit leading to problems, right, or leading to some kind of sin in a Hebrew or a Christian or an Islamic tradition, it is evoking the story of Adam and Eve. So that's one place it might go. But a deeper bit of research would look really into how people were writing about dates, in particular, the fruit, the date, in, you know, the 9th century or something like that. That's a really good question. So the third story, we haven't really talked about the third story, but I just kind of want to note that in the third story, and I think Nguyen Thao mentioned this, that the third story really maps onto Shahryar's experience, right? Because in the third story, a man catches his wife with a black slave. Well, that's exactly what happened to Shahryar and his brother, right? And the woman, the cheating wife, turns the man into a dog. So she dehumanizes him again. She makes him less of a man. And we might think, women are evil, right? Shahryar, just like you always thought, women are evil. They sleep with black slaves and then they turn you into a dog, right? And then, however, a girl turns him back into a man, right? So once again, we have a story where one woman is doing something awful. In this instance, it maps directly on to Shahryar's experience, but then a girl saves him, right? Okay, I want to do a little bit of a closer reading over the next, let's say, 20, 25 minutes or so of the second major tale for today. This is the tale of the fisherman and the genie. And in this tale, as we mentioned, the fisherman, please, if you don't have it out, please get out your text, because we'll go through the pages together and do some close reading together. So in this tale, again, the fisherman pulls out a genie's bottle, right, where he's been sealed for nearly 2,000 years. And he frees the genie, and the genie says, "Thank you so much for freeing me. Now I shall kill you," right? First of all, what can we make of that? How can we understand that? Well, once again, we are in a world of inverse justice, right? And the genie explains how essentially he's gone insane. He's gone insane in his captivity. For the first 100 years, he was thinking kind of rationally. He says, for the first 100 years, I thought, whoever frees me, I'm going to give them everything. I have this power. I'm a genie. I can grant wishes. I will give them whatever they want. I'll make them rich and wealthy and whatever. And he keeps thinking this way until suddenly his thinking becomes a bit deranged, right? And he starts to kind of think that instead of rewarding the person who saves him, he will kill the person who saves him. And so we have a kind of deranged thinking here, a deranged logic, really a mental illness, you might say. And I think that that is relatable, because if you really think about what Shahryar is doing, Shahryar is a terrifying, mentally deranged man. For 3 years, every night he marries a woman and then sleeps with her and then kills her. Shahryar has some real issues, right? So those issues relate to the injustice that he's bringing into the world through his deranged thinking, through his emotional derangement. He is bringing injustice into the world. And that's exactly what the fisherman says to the genie. You will reward goodness with evil. This is injustice. And he says, it reminds me of a story, right? These are what characters are constantly saying in these stories. Aha, this reminds me of a story. Let me tell you a story about injustice in order to see if I can teach you a lesson through that story. So he begins to tell him a story about King Yunan and Duban the sage. And this begins on page 33, but I think I want to go to page 40 or so. So if you can go to page 40, we'll start reading around there. And the question is going to be, will these stories teach the genie the right lesson? Now, we have already seen that the merchant and the 3 old men did teach the murderous Ifrit a good lesson. They told him 3 stories, and the Ifrit learned a lesson, right? Again, you can see a pattern here, right? Again and again and again in these stories, you're going to have murderous, chaotic, unjust individuals who are told stories, and it reshapes their thinking. It transforms them into just people who think the right way. That's, of course, what's going to happen here with this fisherman and this genie. But let's look at how the stories work. King Yunan and Duban the sage. How does it work? King Yunan has a problem. He has a disease called leprosy. And he calls for Duban the sage because no one can help him. And on page 33, we won't read this, but I'll just give a quick overview so we have context. Duban the sage comes and heals him. And he heals him in this really remarkable way. He puts medicine on a polo stick and he has the king play. And the king doesn't even realize that he's being treated. He just thinks he's playing a game of polo. But through this process, this medicine seeps through the pores of his hands and it heals him, and the king is healed. So far, so good. The king loves the sage. The king says, I am going to be grateful. I am going to show gratitude. You saved my life. You healed me. Let me reward you. And he heaps rewards upon Duban the sage. But then a base servant, a bad vizier who is jealous of Duban the sage, plans treachery against him. And the vizier says to the king, let me tell you a story. And the vizier tells the king a story. Let's read that story on page, it starts on page 39. But I think we'll maybe read from page 40. And let's think about what this story is doing, okay? Within this broader context, we have a vizier talking to the king about how the king should not trust the man who helped him. And the vizier says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm mistaking the order. It's the king who tells the story first. I'm sorry, I'm mistaking the order. The king tells the story of Sinbad. It's hard to keep all these stories in line, right? The king tells the story of Sinbad. So the king is saying, why should I hurt the person who harmed me? If I hurt, or why should I hurt the person who helped me? If I hurt the person who helped me, that will be kind of like what Sinbad did with his falcon. What does Sinbad do with his falcon? Well, the falcon warns Sinbad that there's poison. But Sinbad is not heeding the falcon's warnings, right? And what does he do to the falcon? He strikes out at it, right? He's annoyed with it, he strikes out at it, even though it's trying to help him, and he does not realize that, and he essentially kills his falcon. So what's the moral of this story? If people try to help you, don't hurt them. Don't be a fool like King Sinbad. Don't react with violence, right? Don't react with violence. Now, what does the vizier say? We can start to read a little bit now. On page 40, the middle of page 40, the vizier says, "Great king, Sinbad acted out of necessity, and I can see nothing wrong with that." What do we make of this? Stories are open for interpretation. The vizier offers his own interpretation of the story of Sinbad, and it is wrong. It is the wrong way to interpret the story of Sinbad. Clearly, there is something wrong with Sinbad's violent behavior. The vizier is a manipulative person who is trying to teach the king wrong interpretations of stories. How you interpret a story is very important in the 1001 Nights. It might be the most important thing. The vizier is offering a wrong interpretation. So we have this metatextual lesson. These are stories about storytelling. Thus, they are metatextual. Anything meta means something about the thing itself, right? So metafiction is fiction which is about fiction. A metafictional story is a story which is reflecting on the act of storytelling and reading itself. And the metatextual lesson here, the metafictional lesson here, is that how we interpret a story shapes our values, how we interpret a story shapes our actions, and how we interpret a story can have life and death consequences. If you interpret a story well, you will see your world clearly. If you misinterpret a story, you will see the world through a false haze of illusion. The vizier is offering a willful, deliberate misinterpretation of the story. He's trying to fool the king. He's trying to make the king think that the king should not trust the sage. Does this make sense so far? Okay, let's read on now. The vizier, now we get to the vizier's story. Now I've got it in the right order. The vizier on page 41 says, "Let me tell you a story in return," right? Let me tell you the story in return, and we can read this one. This is on page 41. I'm looking at the first full paragraph on page 41. The vizier says, here's a story about a young prince who went hunting with another vizier. And he's thinking that this vizier in the news story, the servant of the king in the news story, is kind of like the sage, right? He's someone who is helping the king, and he's going to make a mistake. That's going to be kind of the point of his story, but it's going to get a little convoluted. He says on page 41, the servant of the king takes the prince hunting. This is the vizier's story. The servant of the king takes the prince hunting, and the prince sees a big animal, and he chases after it, and the vizier, who is his chaperone, his attendant, lets him get away, and that's the vizier's mistake, right? So what happens next? The prince is on his own in the forest, and he finds not a big beast that he was hunting, but he finds a young girl. And we read the story now, page 41, the first full paragraph on page 41. When the prince heard this, that the girl was alone and lost and afraid, he felt sorry for the girl, and he took her up behind him on the back of his horse. On his way, he passed a ruined building, and the girl said she wanted to relieve herself. What a lovely detail, you know? Characters in fiction never relieve themselves. Why not? He set her down, but she was taking so long that he followed her, only to discover that, although he had not realized it, she was a female ghoul and was telling her children, I have brought you a fat young man to eat today. So a ghoul, again, is like an evil spirit in Muslim folklore who's believed to plunder the graves of people and eat them, right? It's where we get the word ghoul from. So she's a ghoul and she's going to feed him to her children, right? And the children say, fetch him to us, mother, so that we can swallow him down. So again, we have a story about women who are not to be trusted, right? Look at how I'm paying attention to the text here, thinking about writing, thinking about doing textual analysis, thinking about how you write a paper. I'm not looking anywhere else. I'm looking directly at this paragraph to think about the meaning of these words on this page, right? We have a misrepresentation. We have women, the suggestion that women are not to be trusted. But look at who is telling the story. The person telling the story is a vizier who is not to be trusted. The person telling the story is a vizier who intentionally, deliberately misinterprets stories, right? So what you have here is quite interesting. On the surface level, it looks like it's a story that is reinforcing King Shahryar's misogyny. Women are not to be trusted. You find what seems to be an innocent girl in the forest. She turns out to be a ghoul who is going to eat you. Women are not to be trusted. But then you look a little closer, right? And you see that it's the person who is telling the story who is not to be trusted. So Shahrazad is sowing seeds of doubt among the king Shahryar's assumptions. Even as she seems to be reinforcing his ideas, she is slowly, subtly, cleverly undermining them. And you see how I can make this argument by getting close to the text. I'm doing close reading here. I pay attention to who's telling the story. That's important. The story looks like it's talking about the evils of women until you realize that the story is being told by an evil man who is a bad interpreter of stories. Is he also a bad interpreter of life? Now, what happens next? I'll read more. So the prince has heard that she's a ghoul and she's talking to her children saying, I've brought you a fat young man to eat, right? On hearing this, the prince shuddered, fearing for his life and certain that he was going to die. But the ghoul comes back out and he's got to like pretend things are cool, right? If he lets her know that he knows that she's a ghoul, she's going to eat him. So he went back and the ghoul came out, and seeing him panic-stricken and shivering because he can't hide it, she asked, why are you afraid? He says, I have an enemy whom I fear. She says, you call yourself a prince? And when he said yes, she went on, why don't you buy him, your enemy, off with money? He won't accept my money, but he wants my life, he told her, adding, I am afraid of him, and I have been wronged. She says, in that case, if what you say is true, then ask help from God, for he will protect you. Now, what's going on here? The prince tells the Gula a story about someone who wants to harm him. And the story is actually a story about his relationship to her. What is the message for King Shahryar here? The message is, pay attention, king. These are not stories about other people. These are stories about you and me. Where does the story go next? Well, the vizier interprets his story for King Yunan. I'm on page 42 now, page 42. At the top of page 42, the vizier explains his story. He explains that the vizier in his story made a mistake. He was not to be trusted. He let the boy run after the beast, and this is why the boy got in trouble in the forest and could have been killed. So he says, this boy prince had a servant he should not have trusted. And he goes on to say in the second line on page 42, as for you, your majesty, if you put your trust in this sage, in the sage Duban, he will see to it that you die the worst of deaths. And it will be the man whom you have well treated and taken as a friend who will destroy you. Don't you see that he cured your disease externally through something you held in your hand? So how can you be sure that he won't kill you by something else that you hold? Some problems here, right? Again, this vizier is misinterpreting his story. He's misinterpreting his own story. He told a story about a vizier who made an error in judgment, who made a mistake. If this vizier in his story is guilty of anything, it is negligence. He uses this story of negligence in order to suggest that Duban the sage, another servant of the king, is deliberately trying to kill him. The moral just doesn't map onto the story. The moral is not really in the story. He's imposing a reading on the story that the story itself does not support. This vizier has not taken a global humanities writing course. He has not learned how to do close textual analysis and how to pay attention to what a story is actually saying. He is deliberately, willfully misinterpreting his story again, just as he deliberately, willfully misinterpreted the king's story about Sinbad. The moral that he proposes is just not there. It's just not in his story. Further, just as he's a bad reader of stories, a bad interpreter of stories, so too is he bad at logic, right? He takes quite a leap of logic when he suggests that just as someone cured your disease, so too can they kill you. This is a faulty, false logical construction, but the king buys it. The king says, you're right, you're right. The vizier in the middle of that page says, betray the sage before the sage betrays you. This is exactly the kind of thinking that plagues the king, right? The main king, Shahryar. It's exactly the kind of wrongful thinking. Kill the woman, betray the woman before she can betray you. Marry a woman, sleep with her, and then kill her before she can betray you, right? It's the same exact logic, but it's being shown here, being exposed here as faulty logic. Now, this king is a fool. This king doesn't know how to interpret stories. This king doesn't know when he is being given a misinterpretation of a story. This king also did not take a global humanities writing course. He doesn't know when he's being fed a line of bullshit. He doesn't get it when someone is feeding him a misinterpretation of a story. He doesn't get it when someone is feeding him false logic built upon false premises. He says, you're right. The sage healed me, and so it somehow stands to reason in this illogical world that he can kill me too, right? So what does the king do? We'll read a little bit more and then we'll stop, just a few more minutes. On page 45. On page 45, the king calls Duban the sage in, and the king says, listen, I have to kill you. I have to execute you. I can't trust you. You healed me, you have the power to heal me, and therefore you must have the power to kill me. So I have to kill you for my own protection. And there's this great line on page 45. In the middle of page 45, under the poem on page 45, in the middle of the page, it says, then he said to the king, this is Duban the sage speaking. Then he, Duban the sage, said to the king, if this is how you reward me, it is the crocodile's reward. You are ungrateful. You do not know how to reward goodness, right? Remember, this is the fisherman talking to the genie, trying to teach the genie to reward goodness with goodness, right? So Duban says to the king, if this is how you reward me, it is the crocodile's reward. The king asked for the story of the crocodile. Oh, another story. Great, tell me another story. And you think to yourself, okay, we're going to go into another story. This is the 1001 Nights. This is how it works, right? Story within story within story. And Duban says, no. He says, I cannot tell you a story while I am in this state. You're about to kill me. You're threatening me with death. How can I tell you a story? A message from Shahrazad to the king. Stop threatening me. If you like my stories, welcome me into your life the way you ought to. Stop threatening me. How can I tell a story when you're threatening me with execution? So he doesn't tell the story of the crocodile. The king says, nevertheless, I'm going to kill you. And Duban on 46 says, all right. Here's what I'm going to tell you since you are intent on killing me. Towards the top of page 46, about 5 lines down, Duban says, I have a very special book, stories. I have a special book which I shall present to you to be kept in your treasury. What is in this book? Asked the king. Innumerable secrets, Duban replied. The least of which is that if you cut off my head and then open 3 pages and read 3 lines from the left-hand page, my head will speak to you and answer all your questions. The astonished king, this fool of an astonished king, trembled with joy. When I cut off your head, you will really talk to me and you'll really give me all the answers to everything? And Duban says, yeah, I will. That's how it works. This king is like someone who Googles their way through life. This is essentially a 1,000-year-old description of what the internet is for us today, is it not? Oh, I just ask a question and you give me the answer and I don't have to think? Oh, great. I don't have to think for myself. I just fucking Google it in this search engine and I get an answer. And I don't have to do critical thinking. And there I am, and that's it. I'm done. Who needs to think? Who needs an education? We have the internet now. I just have this book, and I ask a question, and it tells me what to do. And it tells me how to think, and it tells me how to live my life. The King Duban is a fool. The King Duban is someone who Googles his way through life. The King Duban is someone who has not learned how to interpret his world. He has not learned how to interpret anything. He has not learned how to think. He is looking for easy answers. He's looking for shortcuts, right? So what happens? Going further down on the page, on page 46, I'm about 8 lines up from the bottom on page 46 on the right-hand side of the margin. You see the words king, take this, king, take this on the right-hand side of the margin on page 46, about 8 lines up. Duban gives him the instructions. King, take this book, but don't open it until you cut off my head. When you have done that, Set the head on the plate and have it pressed into the powder. At that, the flow of blood will halt and you can open the book. The king took the book from him and gave orders for his execution. The executioner cut off his head, which fell on the plate, where it was pressed down into the powder. The blood ceased to flow, and Duban the wise opened his eyes and said, "O king, open the book. Open your Google server." The king did, but he found the pages stuck together. So he put his finger into his mouth, wet with spittle, and with difficulty opened the first, the second, and third pages. He opened 6 pages in all, but when he looked at them, he could find nothing written there. What a lovely, lovely detail that there's no writing in this book. Of course there's no writing in this book. What good would writing do for a man like this anyway? This man doesn't know how to read in the first place. Why waste words on him? "Wise man," he said, "there is no writing here." "Oh, open more pages," said Duban. The king opened 3 more, but soon afterwards he felt the poison with which the book had been impregnated spreading through him. He was racked by convulsions and he dies. Essentially, what kills this king? This is a wonderful, wonderful example of death by misreading. Death by misinterpretation. The king has misinterpreted his world. He has misinterpreted the stories that his vizier tells him. And it makes a certain kind of sense that this king, who is such a poor interpreter of texts, such a poor interpreter of life, should get his death by trying to read something which he has no ability to read, because he is a misinterpreter of texts and a misinterpreter of his world. This is death by misreading. Shahryar, are you listening to my stories? Are you interpreting them well? You better be interpreting them well. If you're not interpreting them well, it might not go well for you. Learn how to interpret stories, learn how to interpret your world, right? Okay, let me quickly sum up what we've done here, and we'll get into some writing stuff. I'm sharing my screen again so you can look along on the screen. So we see that through these stories, we have one of the major themes being that the world is unjust and that people either perpetuate injustice or they learn how to read the world correctly. The world is a text. It is something you read. They learn how to read it and understand it correctly. And then they learn how to organize systems of justice into their world. We see this in this tale with the fisherman and the genie. It's another tale about injustice, right? The fisherman frees the genie, and the genie says he'll kill him. So it's another world of inverse injustice. But of course, the fisherman and the Ifrit honor their covenant. The Ifrit, the genie in the fisherman's story, learns his lesson. Unlike King Yunan, he is a good interpreter of stories, this genie that the fisherman has saved, because the fisherman saves him again, right? The fisherman fools him back into the bottle, and once again, the genie is left having to beg to be let out. And we think, who would let him out? Clearly, he's going to kill you, fisherman. But we get a story of mercy. The fisherman is merciful. Are you paying attention, King Shahryar? Mercy is important in this world. Importantly, the genie who is shown mercy is a good reader of stories. He knows how to listen. He knows how to interpret a story. He knows how to understand how stories map onto his world. Remember, this is something that Shahrazad herself knows. Shahrazad's first interaction with another human being in the frame tale is her reaction with her father, in which she empathizes with her father's sorrow by relating a poem. Shahrazad knows how to apply stories in life. She knows how to interpret stories and how to understand them in the real world. This saves Shahrazad's life. This saves the king, saves his life. Ultimately, Shahrazad succeeds after 1001 Nights. She succeeds just as the fisherman succeeds with the genie. just as the merchant and the 3 old men succeed with the Ifrit. All of these people tell good stories, and all of these people transform their audience into good listeners who know how to interpret stories and therefore know how to interpret their world. And therefore, like the genie, like the Ifrit, at the end of the 1001 Nights, the king does indeed overcome this murderous bloodthirst. He learns how to understand his world and how to impose systems of justice in it. He becomes a good interpreter of stories, a good thinker, and a just person. Now we can think about how Shahrazad gets him there, right? How does she do it? And this is perhaps the most interesting question about these stories, how she tells the stories, and how she herself at times disappears from her story. You forget often that Shahrazad is telling the story, right? You get so deep into the story, you forget who's narrating it sometimes. And you forget that often we have narrators of narrators of narrators of narrators, right? As we move into stories within stories within stories. Shahrazad disappears within her narrative. And we might ask what the educational value of that disappearance is. Ultimately, she's presenting the king with a very complicated world, a world quite like our own, in which there is no authority to tell him exactly how to interpret right from wrong. The king has to figure it out. He has to become not a Googler of problems, but a critical thinker who looks at problems in all of their complexity and all of their textures and all of the gray areas, not simply the black and white, and who comes to understand the world in all of its complexity and navigate it in all of its complexity. And that can happen because Shahrazad has removed herself as an authority, telling him how to think. Because she does not tell him how to think, because she does not tell him how to interpret any given story, because she disappears from the story she is telling, the king has to figure it out for himself. Just as you have to figure out for yourselves how to interpret any text in this global humanities class. It's about process, right? It's about the process of figuring out how to interpret things and how to make arguments about the right way to interpret them. So we have a little bit of time left. I'd like to get into writing with our last 15 minutes. I just want to quickly note before I leave this PowerPoint that next time we'll be moving into the Renaissance. We'll be reading Michel de Montaigne and we'll be reading Niccolo Machiavelli. Montaigne will be writing a really beautiful essay. Students usually really enjoy this one. I think it speaks to most students about the education of children. He's thinking about education. He's thinking about how education should work, right? And Machiavelli will be thinking about the education of princes. How should you educate someone for leadership? What is the right way to approach leadership? So as you read these texts from the 16th century, think about my questions on the bottom of the slide, and these will be the ones that I'll put in the Canvas discussion box. We'll do a Canvas discussion again this week. Simply, would you like a teacher such as the one Montaigne describes? Why or why not? Or would you like a prince or a leader like Machiavelli's leader? Why or why not? So think about their good qualities, think about their bad qualities. Let me see, I'm gonna stop sharing for 1 minute because for some reason Zoom sets it so I can't get out of my slides. I can't escape from my slides and move into another slide while I'm sharing. Okay, I'm going to share again now. Now, in the interest of time, I just want to dive right into this, okay? We only have 15 minutes left. So I want to talk quickly, and we're going to be talking more and more and more about writing stuff. I'm going to be building this into almost every lesson from here on out for a while here. I'm going to try to squeeze in 20 to 30 minutes every day thinking about writing, all right? So with that in mind, I also just want to note that the second writing assignment is up in Canvas already. So you have those instructions up in Canvas. You can access the prompts for writing assignment number 2 in Canvas. If you have questions about writing assignment number 2, just email me, email the TAs. We're here and we're happy to help, okay? So I want to talk quickly about research writing and plagiarism. One major question is when to do research. For this class, you need not do any research. You don't have to for this class. What you have to do for this class is read the texts on the syllabus and read them closely. Practice close reading. Don't be like King Yunnan. Don't try to Google your way through life. Don't try to Google a reading of a text and get some bullshit blog which gives you some reading of a text which is neither expert nor necessarily clever. Instead, work through the process of trying to figure out what a text is saying. Again, it's about process. If you just Google it and you read someone else's argument and you think, oh, that makes sense, you really haven't developed as a thinker. You haven't developed as a reader, right? Now, I know it's uncomfortable. I get it. It's not easy. It's not easy trying to figure out what some of these texts are doing. These texts are very complicated texts. You should be confused. If you're not confused, you're not doing it right. You're not reading closely enough. Parts of these texts should be confusing for you. They're complicated. When you get confused, stop. Reread that part. Highlight it. Print out the pages and write on them. Write down your question. Write down what you're trying to figure out about that sentence, that passage, that word of the text. This is the process by which you become a better reader. So there's no need to do research in this class. You are going to learn research skills in your education at Fulbright. You're going to learn them later. This is an introductory core class that has to do with developing close reading skills and critical thinking skills and writing skills. You don't need to get those through research. Research can hinder those, actually, at the stage that you're at. Before you can become a good researcher, you need to become a better reader. So practice close reading. Practice close textual analysis. Practice developing your arguments. Practice those skills first. Research will come later. Why is research dangerous for you at this stage of your education? A couple of reasons. Actually, many reasons, but here's some of the prominent ones. First of all, perhaps you adopt someone else's arguments as your own, right? This is what I kind of referenced a moment ago. You go and you read some blog or something, and the argument that someone tells you about the right way to read 1001 Nights, the argument feels right. It feels good. It feels convincing. And you are now in danger of stopping thinking for yourself. You just say, yeah, no, that's the right way to read the text, and I'm going to go along with that. Now I don't have to think. I don't have to interpret the text myself. Think about King Yunnan reading a blank book. That's essentially what you're doing when you do that. You're reading a blank book. You're essentially listening to your vizier, who might be a poor reader of stories, who might be a misinterpreter of stories, but who is feeding you a line about the right way to interpret a story. And you're saying, yeah, that sounds right. I don't have to think anymore now, right? Number 2 here, often when students at this stage, at this introductory stage of like freshman academic writing, try to incorporate research into their papers stop making sense. What happens a lot, I can tell when a student has done a lot of research. I can tell, I can see it. Because they start to throw in ideas that are not their own, and they're just throwing in a bunch of random patchwork ideas. Here's another idea that I read somewhere on this webpage, and here's a third idea that I read somewhere on this page. And there's no real care taken to show how they weave all together. And there can also be a lack of care taken to show how they connect to the text directly. What you need to do is close reading. Think about how the outline is designed, the outline template I sent you. You offer a quote, and then you say how to explain that sentence. Often when students do research and they haven't quite been trained in how to do it, they'll offer a quote, and then they'll offer some idea that they got from reading a blog about this text broadly. And there will be no connection between the analysis of the quote and the quote. There will be no attempt to do close reading and explain how the quote is working in the analysis, because the quote will be one thing, and then the analysis will just be an idea that they got from something they found online that actually doesn't relate to that specific quote. Does that make sense? So you have to get close to the text. Get close to the text. You have to explain what the sentence in the text is doing. That's the analysis part. Often also when students draw on research and they don't quite know, they haven't developed close reading skills yet, they will just offer the research, the conclusion of the research, someone else's conclusion, and they won't really show how to get there, because they won't do the close reading of the text that you need to draw your reader to that conclusion, to make that conclusion convincing. Now, numbers 3, 4, and 5 are related to plagiarism. And actually, these are less problematic than numbers 1 and 2. Numbers 1 and 2 are the real problems, because numbers 1 and 2 have to do with critical thinking and interpretation and analysis. If you start to do research before you've learned how to do close reading, you're not ready for research yet, because you need to apply those same close reading skills to your research. Number 3, 4, and 5 are getting into kind of just more simpler research problems, in fact. Poor citing, incorrect citing, drawing on unsophisticated sources, a lot of the research that I see students doing, because you haven't been trained in research. And again, that's fine. You're going to be trained in research. It's coming. It's coming. It's not for this class yet. What's happening is students draw on really, really poor sources, like blogs, like articles that are not written by professional experts, scholars, PhDs who've done research, who know how to do it, who go through a peer review process in which other scholars read their work and figure out if it merits publication. To get published as a PhD is a whole long process of checks. You have to go through a lot of checks to make sure that what you're saying is valid and merits publication. Now, anyone can just publish whatever the hell they want online. And often what those people publish online is inexpert, unsophisticated, unprofessional. Essentially, what you end up reading is a lot of poorly executed analysis that is parading as research, but is not real research. Of course, the other big problem is that you plagiarize. Now, what's plagiarism? Plagiarism is when you adopt someone else's ideas or language and you pass them off as your own without citing them. And this is important. It's not just when you take a sentence and write someone else's words. That's obvious plagiarism. That's egregious plagiarism. That's particularly bad plagiarism. When you take a sentence from someone else's writing and you don't put it in quotes and you don't cite it. That's plagiarism. But it's also plagiarism if you take someone's idea. So if you read someone's thesis online and you say that same thesis in your own words, that is plagiarism. You're stealing their idea. So this includes paraphrasing someone else's argument. Now, to avoid plagiarism, just cite. Always cite. And you should want to cite. First of all, I don't think you should really be doing research in this class. That's not what this class is about. But if you must, then you should cite. Always cite. Put everything in quotes, even when you're paraphrasing someone's own work, someone else's ideas, but you're doing it in your own words. You cite your research. You say where you're getting it from. And you should want to do that, because actually in the real world of research, when you become a real professional researcher, which you will be by the time you graduate, you want to show your research. It's good. You're proud of it. You want to show that you're well-read, and you want to show that you've been reading the right things. Not blogs, not Wikipedia, not some bullshit article that someone just throws up online, but actual real sophisticated sources by real sophisticated professional experts who have gone through a real sophisticated process of checks called peer review, where other real sophisticated experts have read their work and decided that it should be published. Now, what is citation? How to do it? There's different styles. MLA, APA, Chicago are the main three that you will encounter in life, and they are related to different disciplines. For this class and for the humanities in general, you tend to cite MLA or Chicago. Either of those styles are fine. And anytime you cite, you need to do two things. Number two is the one that most students are aware of. You have a full reference page at the end of your paper. But you also need an in-text citation. The in-text citation shows the exact place in your own writing where you are drawing on a reference. And it comes in the form of a parentheses and an author's last name and a page number in MLA style. So here's an example of an in-text citation. I'm quoting from Sophocles, I'm quoting from Oedipus, and I tell you this is by Sophocles and this is Oedipus, and it's on page 83 of Oedipus. And then I would give the full reference at the end of my paper, right? Now I'm going over this quickly because you don't have to do this for this class. But if you do research, if you go against my advice and you do research, then you absolutely have to do this, or you're plagiarizing. We don't have too much time, so I'll skip some of my other things here. If you want to see how to reference, here's where you go. This beautiful, beautiful website that can help you. It's very accessible. It's very easy to understand. It's called the Purdue OWL from Purdue University. OWL stands for Online Writing Lab. And this is really, you could just Google it. If you Google Purdue OWL MLA style, it will take you here. It'll be the first thing that pops up. If you have to write a science paper in APA style, Google Purdue OWL APA style, and it will be the first thing that pops up. This is one place where you can Google your way through life. You don't have to memorize how to do this kind of styling. There are style guides which remind you of how to do it. And I think I have it up here. I'll just show you the page really quickly. So this is where it would take you if you follow that link. Here's the MLA page of the Purdue OWL. And if you look on the left-hand side of the page, you'll see this whole menu of things that you can look up. If I want to do in-text, if I need to do in-text citation, how do I do it? I just click on that and it's going to tell me all about it, right? And if I need to do a full reference, well, I need to think about what I'm citing. Am I citing a book? Is it an electronic book? Is it a print book? What kind of book is it? Is it a chapter from a book? Is it a chapter from an anthology? Is it a periodical or a journal? Is it an electric source? Figure out what type of source you have, and then click on this. Well, it's a book. And you'll get all these other kinds of categories to help you figure out what kind of book you have. Is it a book with two authors? Is it a book with by a corporate author or organization? Is it a book with no author? Is it a translated book? And you'll see exactly how you translate that or how you create a reference for that particular book. Now you also have learning support. Learning support can help you with questions around plagiarism and research. And you also have me and you also have your TAs. And I would suggest, again, you don't have to research for this class. That will come. We're going to teach you how to research. Right now in this class, we want to teach you how to read. We want to teach you how to read closely and carefully and how to instruct arguments where you're paying very close attention to a text and doing rigorous textual analysis. We're going to talk a lot more about how to do that. We're going to look at a lot of examples about how to do that. But that's what you should be focusing on in this class. Now, if you do some research, regardless of that, and you're not sure about how to cite your research, just email me. Super easy. I'm here. Just email me. Tell me what you're trying to tell me what you're coming up against and how you're trying to, whether you have to cite or how you should cite. I'll help you with that, okay? But again, you really don't have to do that for this class. And it's not even recommended, because before you learn how to do research, you have to learn how to do close textual analysis. And that's what we're here to practice, all right? And that's where you really learn the process of writing, of reading, and of critical thinking. And then later, you apply that same process to research. You apply that same process to reading other scholars' writing and figuring out how they are interpreting their world, how they are conducting their research, how they are interpreting a text. And now you have the skills and techniques that you need to read research critically and not just believe everything you hear. Don't be like King Yunnan. No death by reading in this class, or death by misreading. Okay. I just want to note, I talked to Patrick Theondel in Learning Support the other day about this, to ask about resources that we have for plagiarism, more that you can learn about plagiarism. And he reminded me that you have this academic integrity credential that you have to complete, right? You have to complete it on Canvas by November 26th, so it's coming up. It's in Canvas, and I guess that your grades go on hold if you don't do it. So this is a good opportunity to do that. It's a good moment to acquaint yourself with the rules of plagiarism and learn from this academic integrity credential that is on Canvas for you. And then to, you know, contact Patrick or contact me with questions that you have about it. Oh, okay, I see in the text box someone said that I've got the due date wrong. All right, maybe it's November 24th. Anyways, do it today. Why waste time? Carpe diem, seize the day. Do your academic integrity credential right this moment. No, seriously, do learn about this stuff. It's your responsibility to study up about the importance of plagiarism and how to avoid it. And it's an important thing to avoid. And plagiarism is super serious. And the results of plagiarism will, if a student is caught plagiarizing, I've seen 3 things happen, and I've seen them happen at multiple universities all around the world. Students will get a 0 on that assignment. That's the most lenient thing that can happen. Students will get an F, a failing grade in the whole course. That's the middle path. Students will be suspended or even kicked out of school, and that's the hardest. And I've seen all of that happen. I've seen all of that happen. I've seen students expelled at the University of California for plagiarizing. So be aware that it's serious, and it's up to you to learn how to avoid it. And you do, again, have resources. You have this resource from Learning Support in Canvas. You have me. You have Learning Support itself. So just reach out when in doubt about it. I don't say this really to scare you. I say it to just, you know, give you some understanding of the tools you have at your disposal and how to avoid plagiarism, because it's that important. If you're caught plagiarizing as a professional, it means the end of your career. So you might think that these disciplinary things are, you know, that it's cruel and unusual punishment at the level of the undergraduate student. But if I got caught plagiarizing, if I plagiarized an article, I would lose my job, I'd lose my reputation, I'd lose my standing as an academic. It would be hard for me to find other work, you know? So it's that serious in the professional world. And that's why it's so serious at the world of the undergraduate. That's why we try to impart to you how serious it is, okay? Okay. On that somber note, we've gone 5 minutes over class, and we should end. But thank you, everybody. I'm reading over your outlines. I'm going to get them back to you. I'll email the class when I am able to submit my feedback in Canvas. I'm hoping to have it done in the next couple of days. I'm working on it all day when I'm not talking to you. I'm working on your outlines, okay? So I'll have feedback soon for you on that. And don't forget the Canvas discussion. And importantly, have a great weekend. Okay? Read the Montaigne, have fun with Montaigne. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll stick around for a minute if anybody wants to talk. But feel free to leave, and sorry for holding you over class. Thank you. Cal, please go ahead. I see you have a hand up.
Yes, normally I would be asking questions about the text on the day, but I think I have too many questions that I need to ask you. Can you just repeat your office hours so that I can pay a visit?
My office hours are on appointment, but I tend to hold an office hour right now. I kind of hold an informal office hour right now after class. So you'll notice that I almost always make myself available after class. So we can do it now, and if you want a one-on-one, then you can email me and we can find a time, all right?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. Other questions? Are you-
Yes. I just want to know that do we have to cite if we take the quote from the original text?
Yeah, if you take a quote from our, like a text we're reading, like if you're writing a paper on 1001 Nights and you take a quote from there, do you have to cite? Is that the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Good question. I'll have to say this to the whole class too. No, I don't need you to cite for that. I do need you to do an in-text citation for that. So I need you to tell me the page number. You'll notice that I do this in my slides, right? Every time I give you a quote in my PowerPoint slides, I give you the page number of that quote in parentheses at the end of the quote, or even if I'm paraphrasing an idea, even if I say in my own words, you know, the merchant talks to the genie about this or that, I'll tell you that happens on page 15, you know? So you need the in-text citation part. You don't need the full reference. And that's just my own personal rule. Other professors might want a full reference, but that I don't want you to really worry about that too much in this class. I want you to worry about close reading, and I want you to worry about your argument. Citation is really easy to learn. It's a robot can learn citation. Robots have learned citation, right? So the hard thing is actually doing the analysis, and that's where I want to put the focus in this class. But I do need the page number, because if I want to look up your quote, if I think, is that the right reading of that? I want to be able to like go back and open up 1001 Nights to page 15 and see, read that part and think, okay, is the student reading this correctly? Is there something they're missing here? Is there something that I could say to help them here? So that's a way that we can make sure that we're literally on the same page. Yeah. Yeah, really good question. Yeah, you're right. Really, really well said, Nam. There's a couple of ways into this. You do want to offer quotes generally. You do want to get that close to the text. You want to offer a quotation so that we can see the literal words of the text, and then you can interpret those literal words of the text. Now, there is room for paraphrasing too. And often you can paraphrase in order to give context. You know, I might say in my own words, I might say, the merchant throws the pit of a date and he kills the son of the Ifrit. And then the Ifrit comes and the Ifrit says, and now I offer a quote of the Ifrit's words, right? And now I'm really going to analyze what the Ifrit says. That's where I'm going to put my focus. But you kind of needed my paraphrase of the context to kind of set it up, right? So you're actually always doing both, but then you always want to zero in on the quote, and that's where your real analysis should be focused. Generally, yeah, the paraphrasing can be used to set up context, to kind of help set the stage. Here's what's happening. I'm going to talk about this moment when the merchant throws the pit of the date. And now I'm going to zero into a quote from that scene. Yeah. No, that's better. That's better. Yeah. So thanks, Nam. Yeah. You know, when in doubt, look at what I do in my slides. And that's what you did. So the different texts have different ways of citing. Generally, you just do page number, but then there's some big texts like the Bible that have there's a certain tradition of citation. And there's a way that text is organized according to chapter and verse that enables you to cite it that way. So similarly with like some poems, you'll get line numbers, and then you can cite the line number rather than the page. So there's some differences in depending on the text you're working with, and for that one you did the right thing. That's right, chapter and verse. And by the way, I wouldn't like penalize you if you made a mistake there. You know, I understand that I haven't given you a lot of instruction about how to cite, and that's not really the focus of this class. But I do want to see, so I'm not gonna like penalize students for messing up the formal rules of citation, as long as they are trying to cite, you know? Because if you're not citing at all, then it looks like plagiarism. So that's the main thing. Let me see, Pham, you've had a hand up?
Hi, Kevin. I have like a question on plagiarism. In class, I know that you always give us questions for us to come up with the answers of our own. There are sometimes that you insert the text on your own, and we say it that they are really good points, and we want to draw a thesis on that. So is it still count as plagiarism, or do we need to cite your name when we draw a thesis on that?
Really good question. Really good question, Pham. Technically, yes, you would. Technically, you would have to cite lecture, and you could Google it. Again, it's fine to Google this. You could Google Purdue OWL MLA style lecture citation, and I know they have it in there somewhere. But all of these style guides will tell you how to cite a lecture. So you could cite my lecture. That would be fine. But the thing that you want to avoid doing is taking my lecture and just regurgitating it or reiterating it or saying exactly what I said in lecture. So it's good that if you're seeing how my argument, my interpretation is working, I do that on purpose. Sometimes I try to leave it open and force you guys to kind of try to come up with your own answers. And sometimes I show you how I'm thinking about it and try to model that for you. But the thing to be wary of in your paper writing is you don't want to simply say what I said in lecture. Avoid that. You do want to say something new. So you can build on my lecture. And this would be the same actually with a research argument if you were doing research. You don't just say what someone else has said. There's no value in that. Instead, you say, here's this really convincing argument from Kevin's lecture, blah, blah, blah. And now that we have that set up, we can get to my point, my thesis, which is going to kind of build on what Kevin was saying in his lecture and do something new with it. And that's where you want to be able to go. Does that make sense, Pham?
Yes, thanks, Kevin.
Wow, Nam, what a beautiful, what a beautiful citation of Dr. Kevin Hart in the chat box. That's so funny. You got it exactly right. Exactly right. That's exactly what the citation should look like in text. That's MLA style. APA style, don't worry about APA style in this class. You'll have to worry about that in my wife's psychology class. APA style will have you, what else do they include? They include 3 things. They include, I never do APA style, but I read it. They include the author's name and the year, and then maybe the title, I think. Yeah, they have a bit of a different way of doing it. And in MLA, it always comes at the end, whereas APA, you often introduce the author's name first and the year, and then at the very end of a quote. So you would say, as research has shown, parentheses, Hart, 2021, end parentheses, do not plagiarize. And then you'd open new parentheses and say something like, oh, that's it. It's the author, year, and the page. Thank you. That's right, Tuan. Exactly. And then you'd have the page number at the end. That's exactly right. Yeah. And so for a lecture, you wouldn't need the page number, right? Kook, am I saying your name right? Jang Kook?
My name is Jang. Yeah.
Jang.
So you talk about like close reading and have our own interpretation. So you have any advice to like improve that?
Yeah. Don't First of all, don't expect it to come overnight. You know, it really is a lifelong skill. It's something I still work on every day. And so embrace it as a process and know that it takes time. And with that said, yeah, we're going to be, you know, you can look at what I'm doing every day. Again, I offer my own interpretation of texts. I get into a lecture, right? I kind of split up the class. Half I leave half for discussion, and then I usually try to give a lecture as well. And when I'm giving a lecture, I'm doing close reading of texts almost always. Sometimes I'm giving historical background, but today, for example, was all close reading of text, right? So you can look at what I'm doing and how I'm doing it and think about the moves that I'm making. On top of that, we're going to be looking at papers more. We're going to be working more and more with actual papers, with student papers. I'll be showing you student papers. I'll be showing you student outlines. And we'll think about what's working and what isn't working. And we're going to be doing a lot more of that going forward. So you're going to have more and more opportunities in class to really look at words on a page, look at essays, and really think about where students are doing enough close analysis, where they're kind of making errors in close analysis, where they're doing close analysis in a convincing and rigorous way. So we'll look at examples of that going forward. And I would say on top of all that, keep generating your own questions and then come to me with your questions. And that's a really good way to kind of keep yourself actively engaged in the process. Does that make sense, Chang?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any lingering questions here?
I have a question, but it's related to the text.
Sure.
So yeah, I read 1001 Night, and I feel like there's obviously that the king himself has some forms of very strong misogyny towards the woman, and he despises them. But my question is the eroticisms and sexuality in the theme in the story, that why he despised them that much and he considered them of lustful and stuff like that. Why he still, desire them and have sex with them every night before killing them. I mean, I don't understand that, his insanity.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I think that could make for a really good paper, actually. The question of the representation of male and female eroticism in the 1001 Nights. Because there's a fair amount of sex here. And we have the king's sex. And the sex is all right. You know, the sex is not like, I don't mean the sex is good. I'm sure it's just fine, you know. But what I mean is it's not represented in a negative light necessarily in itself, coupled with the fact that he kills his new brides after having sex with them. It becomes atrocious. But the sex itself does not seem to be problematic. And we have to keep in mind that, you know, Shahrazad is having sex with him every night before and after these stories, right? I think I forget what word the translator uses, but they're embracing or something like that, right? And so these stories are surrounded by sex, literally, and then there's sex in the stories often. And that's a really good way to think about how the sexuality of the frame is informing the sexuality in the stories. And I guess perhaps what crosses my mind is a couple of distinctions come up. The question of what male sex looks like as opposed to female sex. What sex is legitimate as opposed to what sex is transgressive. What female sex looks like. When is female sex not transgressive? Does the story ever show us good female sex or proper or legitimate female sex? All of these questions come to mind. And then, of course, questions surrounding sex and violence. Because almost every time we see sex in these stories, we see violence, right? Again and again, a man catches a woman sleeping with someone she shouldn't be sleeping with, and he kills her. Shahrazad and King Shahryar are having sex every night around these stories, and Shahrazad is being threatened with death constantly. She's also in a sexual relationship. She's chosen it, but it's been a coercive choice, right? She didn't really have much of a choice in many ways. And so we can also think about coercive sex and non-mutual sex, right, in these stories. So, there's an old joke in literary studies that all literature is about two things: sex and death. And again and again, you find that it's pretty accurate. So I think you could do a really, really brilliant paper about the representation of sex in Thousand and One Nights, and I guess that's just to encourage you in pulling out those themes. Look for any instance of erotics and think about how it's being represented.
Yep, thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thanks, Laman. Yeah. I think that one, I forget. This is again getting into the really, really intricate labyrinthine publication history of the Thousand and One Nights, which I am not an expert on. But I think that might have been one of the stories that was introduced by the French translator, an early French translator. There's stories that are kind of extraneous to the Thousand and One Nights that get inserted into it in European traditions, which appropriate these Arabic tales and kind of Europeanize them. Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves might be one. I don't remember though. That's interesting. But yeah, you know what? I've thought about teaching a children's literature course. I will eventually, I'm sure. Because the great joy of children's literature is that really no children's literature is for children. If you go back and read the stories of your childhood, some of them quite famous, Disney, just look at any Disney story and go find the original story from like 300 years ago. Read the Grimm's brothers stories of the Disney stories, and you'll find really wild, crazy stuff. I mean, the famous one is that Sleeping Beauty, the story of Sleeping Beauty and Prince Charming, he gives her a kiss and she wakes up, which is already kind of scary and creepy. But in the original, it's like a whole other level. Prince Charming is a necrophiliac and he doesn't kiss her, he sleeps with her. And she's not sleeping, she's dead. So he finds a woman's corpse and he has sex with it and she comes to life and falls in love, right? So, I mean, children's stories are wild. They're wild and crazy. And this story is certainly wild and crazy in a similar way. And then, of course, the interesting thing is the way they get censored in modern society. And they get censored and they get, what's the word, Disneyfication, right? In Disney, you get the Disneyfied version of Sleeping Beauty where it's all romantic, right? But, children's literature is totally messed up and full of all kinds of really wonderful, weird, very transgressive and provocative stuff. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. These tales are not for children, and yet they kind of get packaged that way by some publishers, right? Oh, wow. That's great. That's really, really, really interesting. I mean, this is where you get into what you're doing now is comparative literature. This is the comparative literature is the way that you look at different literary traditions across linguistic and national boundaries. And that's what I do. I do it predominantly with European traditions. But you know, what you're doing is a really interesting research project potentially, you know, where you look at the translation choices and the cultural choices and the narrative choices in this instance of translation, and really look at the violence that can be done to a text as one culture appropriates it from another, right? And again, to kind of go back to the, you know, the French appropriation of the Thousand and One Nights. Thousand and One Nights is a text which has a long history of cultural appropriation, which kind of maps onto imperialist projects of the West's consumption of Eastern culture. So that's great. I think that's cool you're reading that. Maybe next time I teach it, I can bring that in. I can bring that quote in and we can think about how that changes it. And that goes to something that Laman was just talking about. You know, also Laman, anytime you think about marriage, you can think about sex here, of course. But marriage would be legitimate sex. So that would be proper sex. So anytime anyone references marriage, they're referencing sex. Hey, who has the name blah, blah, blah? I don't know if blah, blah, blah is here. But if you guys know who blah, blah, blah is, will you please tell blah, 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 blah is your friend to write their full name? Because this is how we take attendance. So blah, blah, blah is not going to get counted for attendance today. So write your full name as it appears, you know, in the Fulbright class roster, so the TAs don't pull out their hair trying to figure out who is in class and who isn't in class. As much as I like the renaming, I think blah, blah, blah is a great name. It's a great Iggy Pop album too. Great title of an Iggy Pop album. Okay. Other questions, thoughts? Sung, go ahead.
I just wanna ask if you could like offer some insights into like the way that the stories are kind of intertwined, and you know there's stories inside stories. So one thing that I kind of think of is that maybe like there's the intentions of the authors of the stories, right? And there's also how we can interpret it as the intentions of Shahrazad, like why she's telling these stories in this way. Is it because she want like to make these stories like resemble like the actual world, like the complex world that they were living in, and like force the king to think with nuances? Or is it more of a like she's trying to make the story seem more interesting so she wouldn't get killed? Yeah, thank you.
Really good question. Both, I think. In my analysis, it's both. And this goes back to actually an ancient humanities tradition, and understanding that a course should do two things. It should teach and delight. It should instruct and delight. So it should be entertaining as well as instructive. And that goes back to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, who we began class with. This early humanities notion that education happens best as a kind of a form of entertainment in which one is actively engaged, right? And so I think Shahrazad is doing that. She of course, it's important that she stay alive, and so the stories have to be entertaining. They have to be interesting and gripping. And at the same time, somehow through these stories, she's trying to transform the way this man thinks and acts. So she's trying to teach. What is teaching but the attempt to transform how one thinks and acts? So So I think that the main takeaway, if you want to think about this in terms of writing, look at what we did the past 2 classes. We really used the text to understand the text. We began by asking, how is Shahrazad teaching and what does she want to teach? And to answer that question, we looked at the frame story last time. And we read the passage where she says she wants to change this man from his bloodthirsty ways, right? So I go to a direct quote for that. And then we read how she responds to her father's story and how she rejects it. And that enables us to think, if she's learning from her father's story, how not to teach. And then we move and we ask, well, how does she teach? What do her stories look like? How do her stories differ from her father's stories? We know from the frame tale that she's trying to teach through these stories. So we have a negative example in her dad's story, and then we have all of the examples of her own stories. And through this kind of what we're doing in this process, what we've done the last 2 classes is we've read one part of the text to try to understand another part of the text. Last time we read Shahrazad's reaction to her father's story, and we read her stated project of trying to change the king from his bloodthirsty ways through storytelling. And we used that today to think about how she's teaching and how her teaching differs from her father's teaching of last time, and how her lessons are in some way trying to change this king. And we know about the king. We can go back to the frame story to read about get more of a sense of what the king's mind is like. In what way is he bloodthirsty? Well, he's seeing the world in a black and white way, right? He wants to betray people before they betray him. He wants to kill them before they can betray him. And so we can kind of see how this theme starts to recur in Shahrazad's stories, and we can start to see how one part of the text is relating to and